The 1st of July 1941, the 10th day of the war. Handing me a manuscript that he had been keeping at his house, academician Pavlovsky said to me, "Keep this safe, if at all possible. The situation is extremely grave." A bit later on, Gorodetsky, the director of the archives at the Institute of Russian Literature, came to see me. We discussed at length the issue of the safekeeping here in Leningrad of precious materials, the manuscripts of Pushkin, Lomonosov, Lermontov, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and others. Gorodetsky looked dead on his feet. "He is unable to sleep. What a heavy burden of responsibility you and I have to bear," he said. Indeed, we do bear the heaviest of responsibilities, and I'm not speaking now of legal, administrative, or official responsibilities, the moral responsibility towards future generations. The 2nd of July 1941, the 11th day, the Archive Administration building on the Red Fleet embankment that has seen so much in its time is now living through one more phase in its history. By the staircase that once echoed to the clatter of the sabre worn by officer of the guard Lermontov, where on the night of the 15th of December 1825 soldiers with fat candles stuck on the end of their bayonets came running pell-mell to search the building after the unsuccessful uprising in Senate Square. To the right there now hangs a short section of a girder on a thick wire, and beside it a metal rod to strike it with. This is for use in the event of a chemical attack. It is dark on the upper landing. It is lit only by blue-tinted light bulbs. I walked along the corridor in almost complete darkness, and felt as though I were caught up in one of Meyerhold's stage sets. The archive storeroom at the Institute of Russian Literature produced a painful impression on me. The workrooms were unrecognizable. Everything was in a state of chaos. In the first anteroom, behind the statue of Alexander Veselovsky, 2 40-pail barrels of water were standing, one of which was already leaking. Everywhere there were shovels and boxes of sand. A fire hose was stretched out along the corridor. Near the Pushkin room were boxes for archive materials. Some of them were empty, others full. To give credit where it is due, the packing of the Pushkin materials couldn't have been bettered. But there was a great deal of nervous tension, confusion. Right beside the boxes, one of the archivists was dictating an article on fascism to a typist. Someone else was compiling a list of what was to be packed in the boxes. There was sand underfoot, puddles of water from the fire hose snaking along the floor, apparently left there to dry out, or else laid out there as some kind of safety requirement. People were jostling about everywhere, in the working areas of the archives as well as on the museum staircases, carrying sandbags. 2 busts of famous writers were leaning beside the reading room doors. They had been removed from somewhere in a hurry and abandoned on the floor. Director Gorodetsky had done a great deal towards safeguarding the materials, but he had perhaps got a bit ahead of himself. Uspenskaya, the daughter of the writer Uspensky and herself working in the literature archives, said to me, pointing to the mess, "Perhaps we have actually overdone it." Gorodetsky himself was weary to the point of exhaustion. He had had no sleep for 3 or 4 nights in a row. He spends all his time at the archives, stirring things up, constantly in conflict with the administration. Consequently, his nerves are totally shattered. "I will definitely leave as soon as I have fulfilled my duty," he told me. There is no question of me staying in charge of the archives. They don't understand me, and the administrators reproach me for my obsessive preoccupation with the archived materials, for my perseverance. The monument to Peter the Great is being covered with sandbags. In the little Rumiantsev garden, the trenches or dugouts have been completed. The sphinxes are still there. As always, they are sublimely indifferent. I simply cannot make out whether what I hear is a noise inside my ears or the drone of propellers. It is now silent, menacingly silent. But you know that the moment will come when such silence will be shattered by a dreadful crash. Fires will break out. Huge buildings will be reduced to rubble under the impact of high explosive bombs. People will be wounded, killed, driven crazy, flayed alive by shrapnel. All this will have to be endured, and endured probably in the very near future. If you allowed yourself to dwell on it all the time, you would undoubtedly go out of your mind, or, at best, you would cease to be a viable human being, and be reduced to an empty shell. I hope this won't happen to me. I still have plenty of zest for life. The 3rd of July, 1941, the 12th day. Those who heard Stalin himself speaking are saying that his speech was very hard to hear, and that there were many parts of the speech that they found incomprehensible. My driver, who heard the speech, commented that Stalin's accent was extremely pronounced, and that there were pauses during which you could hear the gurgle of water being poured into a glass. It is going to be a fight to the death. In retreat, nothing must be left for the enemy. That was the gist of Stalin's speech. The 5th of July, 1941. The 14th day. The whole morning my wife was clearing out the attic, carrying planks and all sorts of rubbish down to the courtyard. There was no end to the stuff that was thrown out of the attics. Rubbish accumulated over more than a century. Our building was radically restored 6 years prior to the First Patriotic War, that is to say in 1806. It is quite beyond our capabilities to organise an adequate and effective fire-watching rota for our staircase. What sort of things am I, an avowed humanist, dreaming about nowadays? Here is an example, taken from a newspaper cutting. In response to the threat of a German invasion, the people of London have erected a scaffold near one of the buildings demolished during the Blitz, with the inscription, "Ready for Hitler." However, he should not be hanged immediately, but brought to judgment first. Representatives of each of the countries destroyed by Hitler should be summoned. A man and a woman from particularly devastated areas should be invited to serve as members of the jury. Documents and examples taken from the countless mass of material evidence testifying to the monstrous cruelty of Hitler and the Nazis should be gathered together. A museum housing these relics should be set up for the edification of posterity, to demonstrate to future generations the horrors and the suffering inflicted on people by the ruthless conqueror. Hitler's predecessors should find a place in this museum too, the world's killers and vandals, whether they met with good fortune or bad, such as Napoleon and Kaiser Wilhelm, Tamburlaine and Attila, and other assorted scum of the so-called history of humanity, or to be more precise, of the history of pre-human society. Perhaps the place for Hitler is not even among this assemblage of the great, but simply in the ranks of stinking scoundrels like Cain, Herod and Judas, names that are held in contempt the whole world over, names that stink. The 7th of July, 1941, the 16th day, a tense day. The air raid siren sounded 4 times. We heard no shooting. They say that some lone enemy planes appeared over the city yesterday, but no alert was declared. Everyone says that an enemy plane was shot down over the outskirts of Leningrad and that, having crashed, it burst into flames. St. Isaac's S, with its huge gilded dome visible many tens of kilometres away, like a lighthouse 100 metres high, is losing its eye-catching appearance. The main gilded dome and the other small gilded domes are being smothered under some grey substance. The bronze horseman has not yet been covered with sandbags, nor have the sphinxes been covered at all. But Rastrelli's statue of Peter the Great, which used to stand in front of the engineer's castle, with the inscription, "To great-grandfather from his great-grandson," has been dismantled. Only the bare pedestal remains. 3 days ago they were evacuating children. Now they are supposed to be evacuating not just children, but adults too, if they are in a position to be able to accompany their children. All the principal treasures of the Hermitage have been evacuated to parts unknown. Today, academician S.I. Vavilov came to see me. We decided to add our archive treasures as well to the second of the Hermitage special trains. Some we have already handed over to them. The mosaic portraits of Peter created by Lomonosov, 2 18th-century maps of Petersburg by Leblon and Makayev, and the gilded casket kept in the Academy of Sciences in which reposes an order of Catherine II's, written in her own hand. There are no words to describe my state of mind when the mosaic portrait of Peter I, founder of the Academy of Sciences, which I had been watching over with such love and care, was being taken down from the wall. When they were taking away the gilded casket, the chef-d'œuvre of a master craftsman of the 18th century, when the storehouse to which I had devoted so much energy and love was being stripped and pillaged. The Hermitage workmen carefully removed the portrait from the wall and carried it out to the waiting lorry. I saw them off. I can't conceal it, in great anguish. I was acutely aware that I might never see them again. To the best of my ability, I had been building up the archives and museum of history of one sector of our great Russian culture, that of the Academy of Sciences. The war has disrupted the system and laid bare the places where these relics were kept with such loving care. In the first instance, we had considered keeping them safe in situ, but now, taking into account events at the front, We are concerning ourselves with their evacuation. I think that evacuating them along with the Hermitage collection will be a safer thing to do. But my heart is aching. I went home feeling utterly desolate. The 13th of July, 1941, the 22nd day. The car I was expecting never came, and so for 4 hours I stood or sat under the columns of our academician's home. Within the span of a few hundred metres, less than a kilometre, were spread before me the Neva, the bridge, the Sphinxes, the Academy of Arts, St. Isaac's S, the Admiralty Spire, the monument to Peter, now hidden inside a casing of wooden planks, the former Senate building, the old houses along the embankment, the distant Winter Palace, and, right by the bridge, the Rumiantsev House with its famous museum, and also the former English embankment. Over to the west, the new Admiralty on the right bank of the Neva, the Baltic shipbuilding plant, the Institute of Mining, the Naval Academy, the former Kiev Church Chapter House, the old straight streets of Vasilyevsky Island, the ships standing at the jetties and the powerful tall cranes on the banks, where the Neva rounds the promontory of Vasilyevsky Island. This is my city, whose beauty had once enraptured Dostoevsky when he was standing on this very bridge, formerly the Nikolaevsky Bridge. Here is the Senate Square and the vista opening up from it towards the spit of Vasilyevsky Island and the Academy of Sciences with the Pushkin House, whose praises were sung by the poet Bloch. Here is the proud monument to Peter I, the Bronze Horseman, and here the Neva, celebrated by Pushkin. Here are the Sphinxes which have given inspiration to many poets, artists and scientists who passed their way. A wonderful city. And can it really be true that it is threatened by the danger of an enemy occupation? No, no, no. For 4 hours I was lost in admiration of the marvellous panorama of my native city. I will never leave it. If things turn out badly, it would be better to die here, somewhere along the embankment or in the deep waters of the Neva. But our city, and I firmly believe this, will never fall into the hands of the enemy. The 15th of July, 1941, the 24th day. Today we transferred our greatest treasures from the archives to the Hermitage. Lomonosov's and Kepler's manuscripts, the drawings from the Kunstkamera, and so on. They will be sent on the Hermitage's second special train to a place of safety. Which one? We don't know. In all, 30 boxes were packed. We used everything we could to prevent the possibility of damp and dust penetrating them: tar paper, cellophane, oilcloth, cardboard and wrapping paper. The archive staff have worked solidly throughout the past 2 weeks. We compiled a list of contents for each box. The boxes were bound with wire and lead seals attached. I accompanied the lorry with the boxes from the gateway out onto the embankment, the way you see off a loved one, a son, a daughter, a wife. For a long time I watched as the lorry made its way slowly across the Dvortsovi Bridge. I had told the driver to go carefully. I went back into the archives feeling bereft. Food ration cards are being introduced. The lists have to be drawn up by 10 tomorrow morning. It is all being done in a big rush. The people themselves are fully in favour of this new, or to be more precise, this time-honoured initiative. We have been ordered to hand over to our security department all Leningrad guides and street maps. 16. The 17th of July, 1941. The 25th and 26th days. Rumours are reaching us that there is a serious lack of coordination and poor organisation. This scares me. What is it that is so frightening about the Germans? Precisely their exceptional organisational ability, their attention to detail, the smooth coordination of their actions. The situation regarding the evacuated children is not good. I think that evacuating them along with the Hermitage collection will be a safer thing to do. But my heart is aching. I went home feeling utterly desolate. The 13th of July, 1941, the 22nd day. The car I was expecting never came, and so for 4 hours I stood or sat under the columns of our academician's home. Within the span of a few hundred metres, less than a kilometre, were spread before me the Neva, the bridge, the Sphinxes, the Academy of Arts, St. Isaac's S, the Admiralty Spire, the monument to Peter, now hidden inside a casing of wooden planks, the former Senate building, the old houses along the embankment, the distant Winter Palace, and, right by the bridge, the Rumiantsev House with its famous museum, and also the former English embankment. Over to the west, the new Admiralty on the right bank of the Neva, the Baltic shipbuilding plant, the Institute of Mining, the Naval Academy, the former Kiev Church Chapter House, the old straight streets of Vasilievsky Island, the ships standing at the jetties and the powerful tall cranes on the banks, where the Neva rounds the promontory of Vasilievsky Island. This is my city, whose beauty had once enraptured Dostoevsky when he was standing on this very bridge, formerly the Nikolaevsky Bridge. Here is the Senate Square and the vista opening up from it towards the spit of Vasilievsky Island and the Academy of Sciences with the Pushkin House, whose praises were sung by the poet Bloch. Here is the proud monument to Peter I, the Bronze Horseman, and here the Neva, celebrated by Pushkin. Here are the sphinxes which have given inspiration to many poets, artists and scientists who passed their way. A wonderful city. And can it really be true that it is threatened by the danger of an enemy occupation? No, no, no. For 4 hours I was lost in admiration of the marvellous panorama of my native city. I will never leave it. If things turn out badly, it would be better to die here, somewhere along the embankment or in the deep waters of the Neva. But our city, and I firmly believe this, will never fall into the hands of the enemy. The 15th of July, 1941, the 24th day. Today we transferred our greatest treasures from the archives to the Hermitage, Lomonosov's and Kepler's manuscripts, the drawings from the Kunstkamera, and so on. They will be sent on the Hermitage's second special train to a place of safety. Which one? We don't know. In all, 30 boxes were packed. We used everything we could to prevent the possibility of damp and dust penetrating them. Tar paper, cellophane, oilcloth, cardboard and wrapping paper. The archive staff have worked solidly throughout the past 2 weeks. We compiled a list of contents for each box. The boxes were bound with wire and lead seals attached. I accompanied the lorry with the boxes from the gateway out onto the embankment, the way you see off a loved one, a son, a daughter, a wife. For a long time I watched as the lorry made its way slowly across the Dvortsovy Bridge. I had told the driver to go carefully. I went back into the archives, feeling bereft. Food ration cards are being introduced. The lists have to be drawn up by 10 tomorrow morning. It is all being done in a big rush. The people themselves are fully in favour of this new, or, to be more precise, this time-honoured initiative. We have been ordered to hand over to our security department all Leningrad guides and street maps. 16. The 17th of July 1941. The 25th and 26th days. Rumours are reaching us that there is a serious lack of coordination and poor organisation. This scares me. What is it that is so frightening about the Germans? Precisely their exceptional organisational ability, their attention to detail, the smooth coordination of their actions. The situation regarding the evacuated children is not good. Mothers are setting off to fetch their children. I gave our typist, T.K. Orbeli, permission to go to Borovichi to bring back her 2 daughters, aged 9 and 12. In those days, Maria Vasilievna Motkovskaya was directly involved in the evacuation of the children. She remembers the events in their full detail. By now, no longer a young woman, she takes it hard to this very day that everything turned out the way it did. Nowadays, we understand that we were moving right into the path of the Germans, but no one realized that at the time. It seemed so straightforward, a very good region, a region deep in the country. And I was appointed as the person responsible to the District Executive Committee for getting the children out to the Novorodskaya region, specifically to Demyansk. And we went straight there. I had with me 2 passenger cars and a lorry. 2 other comrades had been detailed to share the responsibility with me, and we set off. And what was your job? At that time, I was head of the Kirovsky District Department for People's Education. A member of the Executive Committee I was. That's why they sent me. I had a very good deputy, Anatoly Ivanovich Todorsky, who was responsible for sending the children, while my job was to make sure that they would be properly housed. And so I don't know if it's worthwhile telling you all this. Please carry on. This is how it happened. We arrived there. I must tell you that Demyansk had, as they say, got the whole region on its toes to receive the Leningrad children. We had worked out which school would be housed where, all that kind of thing. But a few days later, the order came to evacuate the children again as a matter of urgency. And you had actually brought the children there? Yes, the children had been housed. But they only spent a couple of nights there, then came the order. And by then we were definitely getting the impression that the Germans were advancing fast. And were there many children with you? Many, very many. Several hundred. Not just hundreds. More than that, I can no longer tell you exactly how many. In round numbers, about 6,000 had been evacuated from the Kirovsky district, but some of them had later been sent on to the Yaroslavskaya region. So you see, it was a re-evacuation. Can you imagine what a saga it was? We also had nursery schools with us. We had brought out nursery school children too, and they had to go back as well, almost without any rest. And the Germans were approaching hard and fast, you know. Demyansk is 40 kilometers from Lichkovo railway station. The Germans had landed an exceptionally large airborne force there, and we found ourselves cut off. Later on, they got our shock troops organized there, and the whole of the landing force was scattered. So at that point we began to re-evacuate the children. What were you using as transport for the return journey? Oh, anything we could lay our hands on. The army helped us enormously with this. Army vehicles began to take the children out. I can even remember a particular little incident. There I was, driving along, and I saw a bus parked by the side of the road. One with our children in it, that is. I jumped out. Why on earth had they stopped? They had to be got out as quickly as possible, you know. I approached. The driver was lying on the ground, asleep. I went up to him and called out, "Comrade!" And he said, "Well, now I can drive on. I've had no sleep for 4 nights, you see. I've had a bit of a rest, and now I'll go on. The state I was in, I was afraid to drive any further. I remember it was a lovely day, a really beautiful day. Then the bombing started in Lichkovo, at the railway station. At that time, the children from the Dzerzhinsky district were in Lichkovo. They had gone even further than ours had. But where were the children? I dashed into some big building, because I knew that the children were always housed in good buildings. A teacher was sitting there, surrounded by children. So many of them. And whenever a bomb exploded, they would cry out, "Mama! Mama! Mama!" Terrible. For the first time in my life, I told children a lie. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Those are ours." I went out onto the porch myself. You know, he was flying so low he would look, press, and a bomb would explode at once. They said afterwards that they hadn't known. Rubbish. They knew perfectly well, and they could certainly see perfectly well. The fact of the matter was that the Dzerzhinsky district children were already boarding a special train at the time, and he was bombing the children in the station. Flawless weather. Children dressed in their best. He could see perfectly well who he was bombing. Well, later on, when we had got them all out of Lichkovo, I said that I would go back to Demyansk, just the same, because I had to make sure that we had got everyone out. We got there. We rang round all the village councils. Only the wounded ones had been left behind. And then, I remember it as though it were today, Vasily Yakovlevich and I were walking to the hospital where our children were. We were walking along, and then there were some German prisoners being marched away. Apparently several groups of paratroopers had landed there. I shouted out, "Damn you to hell, just you wait. Just you wait. The time will come when our pilots will be killing your children too." Vasily Yakovlevich said to me, "How could you say that, Maria Vasilievna? Can you imagine that our pilots would ever kill children? It is only they who kill like that." We began to move the wounded children out. We sent them off to Leningrad in good hands with doctors and nurses, and we ourselves went on to the Kirovskaya region. Leningrad had sent my deputy there to help me. He had come to help because there was a really frightful to-do with the relatives and parents going on there, and who could blame them, for what could be more precious than a child? We hadn't got as far as Kotelnik station when the station master came onto the train. He said, "Is the representative of the Kirovsky Executive Committee here?" I said, "Yes. You should know that there's been a message from the Kirov people advising you not to get off the train at Kotelnik." I said, "Why not? There's a mob of parents waiting for you there. You understand what had happened? The parents had arrived at Kotelnik, following along behind us. Do you understand?" Anatoly Ivanovich, my assistant, said, "Maria Vasilievna, don't get out. Let me go instead. Why should you? My conscience is clear. I will go myself. Don't even speak to me about it." Well, we arrived in Kotelnik. I remember I had on such a pale coat, you know. I stepped down, and an angry noise began to rise from the women. Well, they could see that I was composed. I said, "Comrades, let me tell you that if you behave like this, we will get nowhere. Ask me about whoever it is that you are worried about, and I will answer every question, because all the children have been got out, except for those who had been injured. Those ones we met up with, those ones we saw, this is what they were saying. I said to the parents. I will say this to you before anything else. We got literally all of them out. There is only one little girl, Belova, that I am unable to tell you about. Afterwards, they began to question me about individual children, but I was unable to say where this one little girl was. Can you imagine? We checked the lists, rummaged through everything. Nothing. I said, just you wait, I'll find her somehow. And I remember this. I was wearing my pale coat. There were some railway sleepers there. I sat right down on them in that pale coat. And the women called out, stand up, stand up. What are you thinking of sitting there? You will get that coat of yours dirty. I could tell, you see, that the atmosphere had changed by then. Well, so much the better. For 2 days I stayed there in Kotelnish, hunting for that little girl all the time. She turned out to be in that very boarding school, but under a different surname. I said to her mother, get over there. That's where your daughter is. Then I went on to Kirov, and we settled down there. Tell me, what happened to those children? Were they taken somewhere further east? No, why should they be? The majority stayed in the Kirovskaya region, but that was not just our own evacuation zone. There were about 60,000 evacuated children there. But come what may, many soon returned to Leningrad. Amongst those who did so were Alexandra Mikhailovna Arsenyeva and her daughter. When we were back in Leningrad, people would ask us, where have you come from, you refugees? This in spite of the fact that I was born and bred in Leningrad. Even my grandfather was a native Leningrader. You refugees, where have you come from? And it was only the cashier in our local shop who recognized us and said, oh, these are actually neighbors of ours. They are from this very apartment building, I know them well. Did you come back looking so different from your previous selves then? When we got out of the railway carriage, some of us were in overcoats, some in dressing gowns. We had been travelling towards MGA for a very long time, something like 3 days and nights. When the bombing began all down the carriages, there were dead and wounded straight away. We put the children under the seats, piled the mattresses on top of them, covered them with the mattresses, then threw ourselves on them. Inside the carriages, a bomb hit the steam engine. In spite of that, when there was a bit of a lull, we managed to get out of the carriage. By then it was starting to get dark. The station was on fire. There was no one to be found. It was a nightmare. The official in charge of the evacuation was sitting on a tree stump and holding his head like this, clasping it in his arms. He had lost track of his family, and he didn't know who was where. All it took was an outburst of firing somewhere, any kind of noise. We were straight into the ditch there and then, the children with their noses pressed into the dirt, and us on top of them, and we threw blankets over them. Afterwards, when we stood up, the children kept pulling them over their heads just the same. They covered themselves with those blankets like that. Well then, later on, we could make out something moving, all covered in fir branches. Apparently it was a camouflaged train. We made for the station, along the rails. We looked. A train. It was moving forward slowly, so slowly. It would stop and then move on again. It was all closed up. A soldier was standing in one of the doorways and he said, "Miss, give me that mattress. I have a carriage full of wounded here." I gave him the mattress and I threw my daughter after it. Where? Into the carriage? Yes, I threw my daughter in and I said, "Take her," and I intended to get in myself, but the wheels had started to turn, and my daughter was by then inside the carriage. Suddenly I saw that the wheels had stopped turning. I ran flat out. I caught up. I said, "Take me with you." He said, I can't. There isn't room to swing a cat. There's no place to strike a match. The wounded are groaning." I said, "Listen, I have a bottle of wine for the wounded, and I have something else in my rucksack." I was carrying a big rucksack. He said, "Well, get in here then." I hurled the rucksack and jumped myself. He grabbed me by the back, I don't know how, and dragged me into the carriage. Afterwards I donated everything out of my bag to the wounded. My raisins too were handed round, and the wine was handed round. Everyone was groaning. I took my coat off because they were freezing cold, the wounded, and when we had to unload the wounded at Sortirovochnaya, it turned out that my coat was all bloody, and I was left in just my dress, and it was hellish cold.